Welcome to the Elysian Lodge 418 Fireside Chat Series from 2020. This evening we have with us illustrious Merrick, past master of Culver City, Forche. He's going to be speaking to us tonight about the Holy Saints John.
This evening I will be talking about the polarities of the Holy Saints John, a consideration of confluent forces in our lives and in nature, synthesized to work in harmony. To give meaning to its allegories, Freemasonry depends upon the recognition of certain values and concepts that have religious origins. In fact, some of the allegories themselves are religious in nature. Yet its dependency does not commit membership to any preferred institution whereby Freemasonry would be viewed as systematically religious. The acceptance of two religious principles is required for membership under most regular forms of the association: a belief in the Supreme Being, whether or not it is monotheistic, which bears the effect of sealing obligations, and a belief in an hereafter, not according to soteriological doctrine, but capable of evincing the allegory of transformation, even as the same has endured and morphed through the ages, and which is sufficient to validate the haremic legend so intrinsic to the master's degree. One of our lectures states the following: lodges were anciently dedicated to King Solomon, as it is said that he was our first most excellent Grand Master. Lodges at the present time are dedicated to St. John the Baptist and St. John the Ebangelist, who were two eminent patrons of Masonry, and since their time there is or should be represented in every regular lodge a certain point within a circle. This circle is supported by two perpendicular parallel lines representing St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, and on its top rest the holy writings. The inference is, of course, that there is a Christian attachment as confirmed by the twofold sainthood, which has its tradition prominently featured in the New Testament. The inference loses its merit, however, once the non-biblical associations of the Saints John are explained and once their relationship with pre-Christian notions is understood. The primitive associations trace back to the concepts of rebirth, renewal, and fecundity, with the latter being only vaguely expressed within the context of the Enlightenment and under the influence of later Victorian attitudes. Although the concept of rebirth has pagan roots, it has found adequate expression in the Judeo-Christian heritage in such observances as Easter and Pesach, both of which are alluded to in the Scottish Rite ceremony of remembrance. Even these observances, to the extent that they are given attention by the craft, are universal enough to be appreciated by non-Judeo-Christian believers. If on the one hand there is a perception that Freemasonry reverts to paganism, it is purely incidental and is rather the consequence of its penchant for stellar and astronomical phenomena, as these relate to geometry and the art of architecture. If, on the other hand, there is the opinion that Freemasonry is sectarian, leaning to Christianity, it is likely due only to its attribution to the Holy Saints John at Jerusalem, despite their astronomical significance and relevance to the art of architecture. The moral significance of the patronages or the personages of sainthood, however, cannot be set aside, since their application in Freemasonry has universal pertinence, as demonstrated in the example of the circle tangential with the parallel lines. The credible factors connecting the Saints John with Freemasonry are two, and neither is based on religious doctrine. The first is a matter of social custom, as it prevailed in the Middle Ages when stonemasons formed guilds for the protection of their craft. Many European guilds operating primarily in Christian countries or regions participated in the practice of associating their companies with a declared patron saint to establish their identity and validate their standing in society. And in the case of the stonemasons, whose work included the erection of sacred cathedrals, the custom was appropriately followed by naming St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. The second factor was astronomical, placing an emphasis on the canopy of heaven and things perceived as divine. Among the patron saints that could have been selected as suitable for both protection and the pursuit of architecture, the Saint John stood out for their linkage with solar phenomenon and the human creative instinct. Freemasons celebrate the solstices each year at events called the Festivals of the Saints John, reinforcing not only the notions of emergence and recession as might be observed at the time of the equinoxes, but also the height of divine worship and the reaping of providential rewards as observable at the solstitial phases of the year. It is in June each year that Masons celebrate the longest day and shortest night of the solar cycle, and likewise in December that the shortest day and longest night are revered. The four seasonal divisions, denominated as the vernal and autumnal equinoxes and the estive and winter solstices, point to balance as the indispensable character of the architect and his products, and the means by which his edifices will endure. Balance is perfected in the stars and planetary movements, and when the architect and geometrician make their observations, they translate what they see in the stars to earthly perfections by vehicle of their geometrical minds. By the denomination that calls our congregations Lodges of the Holy Saint John at Jerusalem, it can be said that the operative workers of our ancient craft regularly partook in such studies as planetary, solar, and stellar activities, even as the ancients of Asia and Africa who builded the pyramids and ziggurats considered the stars as fundamental, no doubt thinking that their monumental edifices would reach the heights of deity. Yet the European stonemasons, like unto the workers upon the Temple of Solomon, believed in a condescension of deity into the house of God, where at the mercy seat proclamation would be heard that the Lord was pleased with the work on the house. The latter thinking affected human psychology as its mode shifted from one in which God was perceived as remote and unattainable to one of preparation in which manifestation was thought to be imminent. Preparation would have meant the mental and spiritual states of cleanness and devotion, as well as elevated thinking to nourish the creative mind with the human notion to occupy space that would be proximal with divine dwelling. For reasons that the Saints John have retained astronomical and celestial importance, and that their lives and symbolism have represented a relationship with deity, they are fitting devices to develop our minds as speculative builders, even as they so satiated the aspirations of our operative ancestors. Summarily, this is what I would say about each patron saint according to when he was celebrated and how his attributes relate to our customs. Saint John the Baptist, according to both religious and Masonic traditions, has been honored on the 24th day of June of each year, which is proximal to the summer solstice. And Saint John the Evangelist similarly is celebrated on the 27th day of December, near the winter solstice. The Baptist was known for his unshakable faith and firmness of duty to God. His contempt for vice and an inflexible call for repentance were thoroughly narrated. Such ideas are not obscure to Masonic thoughts, and such tools as the plumb and the compasses teach us to walk uprightly in our several stations and to keep our passions within due bounds. The Evangelist is acquainted with agape and its derivative brotherly love. An appreciation for mystery and allegory is inseparably attached to literature with which his name is associated. Here too, parallels can be identified, since such icons as Jacob's ladder and the canopy of heaven help us to perceive the immensity of and to acknowledge our affinity with the world around us and the cosmos beyond. That the solstitial positioning of the two figures suggests a polarity in symbolism is a notion that cannot be doubted. While they both serve the craft of Freemasonry irrefutably, their distinct opposite natures blend sufficiently to make them comparable with the two pillars of the Kabbalistic tree of life, and find their balance in the central column called Tiferet, and likewise with the pillars that stood at the porch of King Solomon's temple, which when viewed in equipoise, manifest in the pillar of beauty. In the former setting, often referred to in later Masonic rites, Tiferet, meaning in Hebrew, beauty, is the synthesis of Guvara and Chesed, meaning in the same language, severity and mercy, respectively. Although tradition has ascribed Kabbalah to Jewish origin, most written forms of its expression follow the Christian dispensation, opening windows for comparative analysis. From this later perspective, the column of severity could be understood as an expression of lex talionis, or the Mosaic law of retaliation, while the column of mercy would similarly relate to the law of forgiveness. Other terms could describe the polarity of opposition, including restrictiveness and diffusiveness, or the confining or outpouring of the human will. And an observable pattern in Freemasonry may suggest a pairing when considering that the obligations candidates assume are by nature austere, and that the charges they are given are by contrast possess gentle bearing. That the Baptist has been associated with the element of water, whose alchemical symbol is an inverted triangle, which element is attributable to his activity at the Jordan River, and also to the nature of water to flow downward, and that the Ebangelist has been associated with fire, whose symbol is an upright triangle, and which element has an ascending quality. One may therefore conclude an astrological association in their relationship. But this is not the case, since the astrological sign of June at the birth of the Baptist is indeed one of water, it being Cancer. The sign in December near the birth of the Ebangelist is one of earth, being Capricornus. Similarly, in the zodiacal offsetting of the sidereal system, one will find the same elemental disparity. One must then consider another criterion outside of the discipline of astrology, whether or not it be tropical or sidereal, in justifying the pairing of opposites. The answer is to be found in the ancient gates of the soul, mentioned in the works of the Roman poet Virgil and those of Macrobius, the Greek Neoplatonist, justifying opposites in cosmological rather than in astrological terms. Baptism by water and fire are a Christological metaphor which, from a religious perspective, further constitutes this distinction of opposing forces, and in the example of John baptizing Christ, we see unification in the birth of the Christian mission. Excess and abundance contrasted with paucity and dearth are considered extremes associated with two distinct aspects of evil and indicate the importance of balance. Although the Freemason's quest is for pure and unmixed light, and although he emerges at birth from a womb of absolute darkness, his duty in the world in which he has been placed since his descent from Eden has been in a mixed realm of light and shadows, which he is expected to navigate with equipoise. Our rituals have described this condition as human life, checkered with good and evil. True monotheism would not be concerned with the enemies of God, for his descendants never were and never can be his equals. Whatsoever is beneath him is ordained by him also. Lucifer and Satan, by divine intention, respectively regulate abundances of light and darkness. Whereas the former is the giver of light, he represents fluidity, limitlessness, and excess. And whereas the latter is the taker away of light, he represents rigidity, confinement, and want. These entities under whose influences sins are often attributed are the result of one leaning or the other, an imbalanced perception of light and darkness as seen from the eyes of mortals. Initially, after the fall of man, his darkness was great, for even the forbidden fruit of which he had partaken transmuted in the amnesic effects of a stupefying agent after it had been consumed, thereby dulling man's sensitivity to sin and error and making all the more necessary the integrated potencies of the holy Saint John. Now, a deeper penetration into the nature of the Saint John may be worthwhile for the Masonic devotee with a penchant for symbolism. The first is firmly established. The synoptic narratives taken from the standard canon, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and subsequent accountings, for example, the Gospel of John, have not departed from the Johannian archetype that has been firmly established. All seem clearly to refer to the same man of particular mind and stature, preaching in the wilderness and autumbrating the advent of a Messiah. In all accounts, he has been depicted as firm and rigid, steering not in the least from the contradeniable objective to prepare for imminent judgment. His remnant was here and now, and quite renegade from the Pharisaic and Sadduceic communities that dominated Palestine in his time. Multitudes flocked to him under the scorching rays of the midday sun, seeking purification and repentance. Without this undertaking, the future, whatever it might have meant to them, would have been for naught. It is fitting that the summer solstice should be aligned with the birth date traditionally associated with the Baptist, since this is the point in the year that represents the epitome of diurnal activity. Ancient peoples eventually realized the solar year as a macro representation of the day and night cycle, with summer equating with the high noon or the sun at the zenith, and winter with low 12 or the sun at the nadir. Social revolutions occur quickly and cataclysmically, even as planetary rotations occur within a day and night. They are not the unnoticeable changes or movements that occur over longer periods of time, but that slowly take root. In the case of the Baptist movement was a steady and constant flow toward the source of inspiration as thirsty seekers traversed the rigors of the desert to attain it. It was a movement quite visible under the rays of the effulgent sun. It was simple and straightforward, unambiguous and direct. It did not recoil under the oppression of detection, nor did it seek refuge by night. And indeed, as was the destiny of many a revolution, a beheading gave it life. The second figure is less established. St. John the Evangelist is generally regarded as John the epistolical writer, yet others believe the appellation describes a disciple of Jesus, and still others John the Divine or John of Patmos, author of the Apocalypse. The vagueness is in part the intrigue, for the state of adventuresome thinking is more appositely disposed for the morrow than for the present. Whether this latter Johannian archetype is derived from one of the three personages above, or whether it is a collective representation of the three, the symbolism would be the same: entry into a new age. The house hath been cleaned, and the dispensation granted, for the message in this case was a gift unto future generations. The remnant included posterity as well as the present. It is a form of speculative encouragement, giving assurance that a former generation had not wrought or prepared in vain. It is fitting that the summer solstice should be aligned with the birth date traditionally associated with the Ebangelist, since this is the point in the year that represents the epitome of nocturnal activity. Even as the ancients realized that the solar year paralleled a day and night cycle, so it is also probable that priests, philosophers, and metaphysical speculators contemplated years of relative darkness and light in alternation, yielding epochs, ages, and eras. Physical and social evolutions are not without distinction, yet their separations are less demarcated since they are transitional, vaguely represented by periods of dawning or twilight. With the Evangelist, movement was outward. It was a movement that began with the planting of seeds and grew over centuries and spread over time. If indeed the Evangelist is the same as the author of the Gospel bearing the same name, then it must be contrasted with the simpler and more straightforward style of the Synoptics, since the former is less mundane and more spiritual, portraying the subject as divine and God incarnate. The tradition that followed was more complex, prompting formal and redacting literary critics to indicate the psychological grounds in which seeds germinated. Efficaciousness of the gospel message was at times dependent upon the shadowy security that the Roman catacombs provided, whereby followers of a tradition had sought refuge by night. And indeed, this was to protect a life which had sprung anew. As had been mentioned, the Evangelist may be synonymous with the authorship of the Apocalypse or the Book of Revelations. If this were so, it would not be inconsistent with nocturnal psychology. The revelations of John are highly interpretive, controversial, and required centuries of evaluation before canonization. Traditionally, epiphanic or revelatory communications are posited in the form of dreams or states of consciousness not achieved under ordinary diurnal awareness. The benefit is the elevation of the ordinary mind into the esoteric realms where the fires of spiritual thirst may at last be quenched. In revisiting the term solstice from a Masonic perspective, it is beneficial to realize the derivation of the expression. Its origin is Latin, from the combined meanings of the nominal expression for the sun, which is sol, and the verbal infinitive to stand still, which is sistere. The impression made upon the ancients was that when the sun had reached either the most southerly or northerly point in relation to the celestial sphere, it appeared to stand still. As the pillars of Solomon's temple stood on the porch thereof, there was the implicit requisition to stand with him as one approached, in acknowledgement of and at a point betwixt, which certainly would have been a meditative position and posture. Since the craft degrees of Freemasonry are built allegorically upon the Temple of Israel, the rituals are intended to place their candidates in a similar position between the biblical pillars named Yochanan and Baaz, or, as it were, between the columns of wisdom and strength, in which position a candidate becomes the hidden pillar of beauty, blending and synthesizing all aspects and attributes of the previous pillars. In a like manner, the initiated brother may at the times of the solstices pause and contemplate the virtues invested in the holy Saint John, embracing all that each represents and becoming himself a member of the triad, hoping that his newly attained Johannine attributes will direct him in the world. Through polarities, which should never be thought of as forces in battlement with each other, but indeed complementary, the integrity and coherence of the universe will be confirmed. The poles, therefore, impute currents or the confluent forces of nature connecting God with man and the heavens with earth. Returning to the gates of the soul mentioned earlier as promulgated by Virgil and expounded by Macrobius, which gates were thought by the ancients to be the point at which the soul enters the earth at the southerly side of the celestial sphere, occupying a mortal body while residing there, and exiting upon death at the northerly side, and acquiring a divine body for its future existence. We are capable of understanding our significance in the whole of God's vast plan, while embracing the tracing board of the vaster realm, becoming the architects of true temples, temples that will never, never fall. Let us therefore stand as we shall, betwixt the great figures that will enlarge our perspective and remove all obstacles to vision. Perhaps in the left hand of the Baptist, one will see a compass denoting the moral boundary line, the moral boundaries that limit his passions in due respect for humanity. The admonitions of Freemasonry are remnant of Noahide and Mosaic laws, thus internalizing the moral aspects that remind us to be circumspect. In the right hand of the Ebangelist may be envisioned the trowel, spreading the cement of brotherly love and affection out of due love and compassion for humanity, internalizing the charity and philanthropy of the craft. The charity practiced in our craft was inspired by the ancient Christians who first embraced the Homeric expression agape, from whence the term charity has derived. It internalizes those practices that give the craft its posture of tolerance and philanthropy. Both archetypes are fitly chosen, since each represents periods or aspects of our craft as its history has imparted. As Freemasonry has morphed through the centuries of its existence, its voice has both stirred and tempered the winds. The moral traits of the Baptists that transcend religious distinction have become indispensable and intertwined with our obligations and traditions. They will ever keep the apostles of Freemasonry on a righteous course. The lofty and transcendental features of the Ebangelist are inextricably woven into our charges and spiritual fabric. As such, ours will ever be an institution in which the relationship between man and his creator will be etched upon the pillars that support it. I have spoken.
This was a fantastic presentation. On the screen right now, we have your contact information. Now, I'm sure there's going to be lots of Masons that are going to have a ton of questions. We've been streaming approximately anywhere from 15 to about 60 people a week on these fireside chats, and it's sort of snowballing in. And you know, of course, these will be online for future Masons to visit and explore. I do have a couple of questions that I want to ask you about your presentation. By the way, excellent presentation. I'm always impressed with the amount of work that you put in to anything that you're involved with. And if I may, I wanted to ask you a little bit what your process was to go about beginning the research for this. I know you're a librarian in your profession.
So your question is, what is the process somewhat that I underwent in order to arrive at these findings? Well, first I have to say they're speculative. That's not based on any particular theory that somebody's put forth, unless there's something out there that I haven't come across yet. But I have a long-standing interest in esoteric philosophy, and that includes the idea of Kabbalah, which has a clear representation of the polarity that I'm talking about in the Holy Tree of Life. They call it Es Chaim. And in that particular system, there are two outer pillars. in the form of a tree, and in a central one called the middle pillar. And I think I stated them with Hebrew terms because traditionally Kabbalah arises out of a medieval Jewish philosophy, and has found its way into Christianity as well, and in other prevalent religious systems in Europe and throughout the world. Then I'm also, I have a background, I've been involved with the Scottish Rite of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry since, I believe, 1974. And if anyone has studied the works of Albert Pike, who is a tremendous contributor to Scottish Rite philosophy, he visits that idea of polarity and throughout his works, and very consistently quotes things like dualism and Mazdaism and Zoroastrianism. So all of these concepts of polarity have been given a great deal of attention in the Scottish Rite. So this is added to my inspiration, as well as my own personal Christian foundation. I've always been had a high regard for the Holy Saints John, but it really goes beyond my personal Christian heritage, because I've looked at these stars and I've looked at planetary activity, and polarity is seen in the cosmos around us, and I felt that had to influence not just Christianity but every other religion on earth.
Well, there's the difference between being smart and being intelligent. Smart is having facts, and we all learn in all 3 degrees. We talk about the Holy Saints John, and we certainly learn ritual and we memorize things. But to make that connection, to actually look into it, to be curious, to look into it, and this is one of the reasons I enjoy Scottish Rite as well, and that's how we first met, through the Scottish Rite, was because it takes a deeper look into things, and it causes men that are willing to think about things and make the connection. That's the difference between being smart and being intelligent. Applying that knowledge and asking why, doing investigative work, looking into things, and then you've arrived at your conclusions, which I think are wonderful.
Well, thanks, and I think it merits the presentation, because, quite frankly, I always, when I present Masonry to the world, people ask me questions about it, and I always give the assurance that it is non-denominational. One merely believes in a supreme being and a belief in an hereafter, in whatever form that may occur, and through whatever religious system it may be interpreted. But I've always stressed that assurance that it is non-denominational. It is useful to anyone, whether he's a Christian or not. And so the question comes up: why is this? What is this attribution to 2 Christian saints, and how can it be relative to to a brother who is not a Christian? And by stressing the cosmological associations with these 2 figures, as it was revealed by the poet Virgil and later by the Neoplatonist Macrobius, I believe this brings it into view that can be appreciated.
After listening to your presentation, of course, it all makes sense, but you had to a lot of thought went into putting this together. I mean, it's a remarkable body of work. So when we read it now, what you're saying makes total sense, and we understand how they arrived at this. And every lodge defaults to a Christian Bible on the altar, and of course that can be replaced if somebody has a different faith, if they want a different Bible, or that's fine. But we always kind of default there. We look there first because that makes sense in the history of how Masonry was formed.
Well, yes, and in fact, in parts of the world, there may be other holy writings that are considered the standard tool that are not the Holy Bible. And yeah. I've seen many places where there may be 5 holy writings.
Not have something, you have to have something
simultaneously. Yeah. And it really is, as I said, the stonemasons adopted the Holy Saints John for a practical reason, because it was just a custom in those days to name your organization after a saint, and they probably would not have been really appreciated or recognized had they not done so.
Mhm.
But beyond that, we know that Freemasonry is much deeper than just its superficial appearance. It's
And all the
not just a
tools are
matter of,
available for guys like
yeah,
you. You came through at one point as an entered apprentice, just like everybody. And you advanced to your capability and your ability. You're an extremely accomplished Mason, so we're very honored to have you. And by the way, our lodge, Elysian Lodge 418, has a nice connection with you. You've always been visiting our lodge through the years, long before I was a member. And you're held in very high regard, not just at the Scottish Rite, but in also many blue lodges such as Elysian. And I'm sure you're a big asset to Culver City for having you.
I
And
appreciate that.
I wanted to give a quick plug that, at the Scottish Rite, of course, you and I are both involved in the Living Constitution. In our last stated meeting, we're going to be recording it. So we're going to make a recorded version. It'll be edited professionally, and that'll be for future posterity. In addition to these fireside chats that blue lodges such as ours are doing, Scottish Rite will put some of the things that they can, not the degrees, of course, but like Living Constitution. So we hope that you continue with us and continue as Dr. Franklin in that play.
And can I request that you continue as Thomas Jefferson with your
Yes,
marvelous
sir.
performance in that same production?
Yes, sir. And in the play, as in life, you become the mentor. So so much appreciated. So we'll talk about that and get a schedule going when people feel comfortable with the COVID situation. We're going to get together and do the recording. We do have permission to do this, so it'll be up to us to decide. And so everybody watching this video, if you're looking for more of illustrious Merrick Hamer, look out for the Living Constitution, which will be produced through the Scottish Rite, coming soon.
Thank you, my brother, and God bless you all.